I never thought my daughter's favorite teddy bear would become the keeper of our family's darkest secrets. After noticing strange patterns at home, I hid a recorder inside her toy to ensure she was safe while I was away. But what I heard wasn't the sound of a sleeping child. It was the chilling voice of a stranger in my own home, exposing a betrayal that has shattered my marriage forever. My name is Daniel. I'm 36. I fly regional routes out of Tulsa for a mid-size carrier. And for 8 years I'd been married to a woman I would have described, right up until that April, as the steadiest part of my entire life. The bear was named Mr. Buttons, a worn brown thing with one slightly crooked ear that my daughter Lily, for years old, had slept with every night since she was 18 months old. I'd bought the recorder online in March, a tiny device meant for elderly parents living alone, small enough to slide into the seam I'd carefully unstitched and restitched along the bear's back. I told myself it was for Lily's safety, a way to know she was resting well on the nights my 3-day layovers kept me in Denver or Phoenix, a way to catch, God forbid, anything wrong if a babysitter ever mishandled her. That was the story I told myself. I think some smaller, quieter part of me had already started building a different reason, one I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Vanessa had left her career designing interiors for a boutique firm downtown 2 years earlier, after Lily was born, a decision that had made sense on paper and had, over time, seemed to hollow something out of her that I'd noticed without understanding. She'd started spending more afternoons next door at the Michaels' place, where our neighbor Grant, a friend of both of ours for going on 6 years, a man who'd helped me re-roof my garage the summer before, apparently had extra hands to help with something in his own renovation, and Vanessa had extra time. And it had all seemed, from where I sat, like exactly the kind of easy neighborly overlap that made a street like ours feel like a community instead of just a row of houses. I was in Denver on a 3-day layover the first time I opened the recorder app on my phone out of nothing but idle habit, expecting an hour of Lily's afternoon nap sounds, the small, ordinary noise of a sleeping child breathing. What came through my earbuds instead was a man's voice, low and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind had even caught up to why. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed 400 miles from home and understood, in the space of maybe 15 seconds, that the quiet, ordinary life I thought I'd built with Vanessa had a second, hidden floor running underneath it the entire time, and that I was about to spend the rest of that layover learning exactly how deep it went. 2 months before that Denver layover, none of this would have registered as anything but the unremarkable rhythm of a marriage that had simply settled into its middle years, which, I understand now, was precisely what let it go unnoticed for as long as it did. Vanessa and I met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 26, married 2 years later, and built the kind of life that looked, from any reasonable outside angle, entirely stable. A 4-bedroom house in a quiet Tulsa suburb, a daughter we'd both wanted for years before she finally arrived, a marriage that had weathered the ordinary stresses of new parenthood without any single dramatic rupture. My schedule as a pilot meant I was gone 4 to 6 days out of every 2 weeks, a rhythm we'd built our whole household around since before Lily was born, and I'd always considered it one of the more functional arrangements among the couples we knew. Vanessa handling the daily architecture of Lily's world, me handling the parts of it that fit into the days I was actually home. Grant Michaels had moved in next door with his own family 6 years earlier, and over time had become the kind of neighbor who blurred easily into friend, present at our cookouts, the person I called when my snowblower died, someone whose wife, before their own divorce 2 years back, had been close with Vanessa in the easy way that happens when your kids are close in age and your fences share a property line. After Grant's divorce, I remember feeling a kind of protective sympathy for him, the sense that a good neighbor ought to check in on a man going through something hard, and I'd been, if anything, glad that Vanessa had kept including him in small ways, a plate of extra dinner sent over, an invitation to our 4th of July barbecue. I first noticed, without registering it as anything worth noticing, that Vanessa's afternoons at the Michaels' house had grown more frequent that February, twice a week, then 3 times, always described the same easy way, always something practical attached to it, helping him pick paint colors for his kitchen remodel, watching his kids for an hour while he ran errands. I remember thinking, distantly, that it was kind of her, the sort of neighborly generosity I'd always admired in her. She started keeping her phone in her back pocket more consistently that spring, rather than on the kitchen counter where it usually lived, charging overnight in the bedroom instead of the kitchen the way it always had. I noticed the shift the way you notice a piece of furniture rearranged 2 inches from where it used to sit. Present, faintly odd, gone from my mind within the hour. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a marriage once both people have quietly stopped asking each other the real questions and started calling the silence peace instead. Maybe you know that kind of quiet. It doesn't arrive as conflict. It arrives as routine, and routine is a comfortable enough disguise that most people don't look underneath it until something forces them to. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because it would be easy to tell this only as something that happened to me. I'd stopped asking Vanessa, sometime around Lily's second birthday, what her actual days felt like beyond the logistics of them. Nap times, meals, whether Lily's cough had gotten better. I told myself I was respecting the fact that she'd built a rhythm that worked without my daily input. I understand now that what I actually gave her was distance dressed up as trust, and there's a real difference between the two that I didn't examine closely enough at the time. The first crack I actually filed away, rather than let pass entirely, came on a Tuesday in early March, when I came home a day early from a canceled route and found Grant's truck in our own driveway at 9 in the evening, later than any legitimate errand or paint color consultation would reasonably run. Vanessa startled, visibly, at the sound of my key in the door, in a way that made me stop in the entryway a half-second longer than I normally would have. "He's helping me move the bookshelf in the office," she said, before I'd asked her a single thing. I hadn't asked. I noted that. The way you note a receipt you tell yourself you'll deal with later, and then didn't deal with it at all. By late March, I'd started keeping a private, half-acknowledged log in my head. Dates, described errands, small inconsistencies that meant nothing individually, and something I wasn't ready to name collectively. Lily, for an unfiltered in the particular way 4-year-olds are, mentioned at dinner one night that Mr. Grant had been at the house when Mommy said quiet time. A detail so small and so specific I almost let it pass without registering what it implied. I asked Vanessa about it lightly, over the dishes. She said Grant had dropped off a tool she'd borrowed, stayed 5 minutes, nothing more. It was, on its face, a completely reasonable answer. I filed it anyway, beside the bookshelf, beside the phone in her back pocket. I traveled to Phoenix for 4 days in the second week of March, and Vanessa texted normally each evening. Updates about Lily, a funny thing she'd said at the grocery store, nothing that read as anything but an ordinary marriage running its ordinary course. On the third night, at 9:40, she sent a message that she was wiped, heading to bed early, and then, on my end, 3 gray dots appeared, indicating she was typing something more. They stayed on screen for nearly a minute. Nothing came through. I sat in a hotel room 1,000 miles away, watching those dots appear and vanish, telling myself she'd probably just gotten distracted and set the phone down. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever watched 3 gray dots blink on and off on a screen, waiting for words that never arrive, you already know the specific, low, cold thing that settles into a hotel room in that kind of silence. It isn't panic yet. It's smaller than that. The sense of a floor you'd always trusted quietly revealing that it might not be as solid as you'd assumed. I let it go that night, the way I'd let the others go. I told myself I was becoming the kind of husband who invents suspicion out of boredom on layovers, and that thought embarrassed me enough to shut the whole line of thinking down for another 2 weeks. She told me, much later, what that particular night had actually been. I'd started typing it 3 separate times, that I needed to stop seeing him, that whatever this had become was bigger than either of us had meant for it to be. I sat on the edge of our bed with Lily's monitor glowing on the nightstand and thought about you at that hotel, and about Lily asleep down the hall, and something in me split cleanly in half. I deleted every version of that message before I could send it, and told myself the next morning would feel different. It didn't. It just felt like the version of me who almost said something had quietly gone back into hiding. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I only had 3 gray dots on a screen and a growing weight I still hadn't let myself name. The subplot that mattered more than I understood at the time came through my sister-in-law, Renata, Vanessa's own sister, who called me directly in the last week of March, careful and hesitant in a way that wasn't like her, to ask whether things were okay between Vanessa and me. She said she couldn't point to anything specific, just an off feeling from a conversation she'd had with Vanessa the week before, Something about Vanessa saying she felt like herself again for the first time in years, in a tone Renata described as almost guilty rather than happy. I told Renata she was probably reading too much into it. Some small, cowardly part of me didn't want her to be right, so I made sure, in that phone call, that I wasn't either. The recorder went into Mr. Button's the following week, in the first days of April, and I want to be honest that the story I told myself about it, that it was purely for Lily's safety, was already, by that point, only half true. I knew, somewhere underneath the surface reason, that some part of me had started building a way to hear what was actually happening in my house while I was 400 miles away from it. Grant's truck stopped appearing quite as often in the following 2 weeks, though it never stopped entirely, and Vanessa seemed, across those 2 weeks, unmistakably more withdrawn at dinner, quicker to check her phone and then set it face down without comment, slower to meet my eyes across the table in a way I noticed, and, once again, told myself was probably just the ordinary fatigue of raising a 4-year-old. I didn't go looking for proof beyond the recorder. That's the part of this I've turned over the most since. I made a choice, somewhere in early April, to become a man who listens rather than a man who confronts, and I've never fully settled whether that decision was patience or simply another form of the same avoidance that had let 2 months of small inconsistencies pass unquestioned already. The first recording that told me anything definite came from that Denver layover in mid-April. Not Lily's breathing at all, but Grant's voice, low, familiar, coming from somewhere in our living room on a Tuesday afternoon when Vanessa had told me, in a text an hour earlier, that she and Lily were just hanging around the house. Nothing exciting. I listened to 11 minutes of audio that gave me no visual, no undeniable proof beyond a man's voice in my home at an hour it had no obvious reason to be there. But it was enough to end, permanently, whatever benefit of the doubt I'd still been extending. I didn't confront her over the phone. I told myself I needed the full shape of it before I said anything. I couldn't walk back. And I understand now that part of that patience was genuine strategy, and part of it was simple fear of an answer I still, on some level, hoped wouldn't be as bad as it sounded. I started listening more deliberately after that, not obsessively, but steadily, checking the recordings each evening of that trip and the ones that followed, building what I can only describe as a quiet, methodical case, the way I'd review a flight log for an anomaly. Over the following 10 days, I gathered 6 separate recordings placing Grant in our house during hours Vanessa had described differently to me. A Wednesday she'd called just errands. A Friday she'd called Lily's early nap. None of the audio was explicit. All of it was damning in its accumulation, the sheer, undeniable pattern of a man's presence in my home at hours it had no honest explanation for. Renata called again in the last week of April, this time with something harder to explain away. She'd seen Grant's truck at our house on a day Vanessa had told me she was taking Lily to a birthday party across town, and Renata, driving past, had noticed Lily's car seat still visible in Vanessa's parked car in our own driveway the whole afternoon. I thanked Renata. I didn't tell her how much of the shape I already had. Lily's comment about Mr. Grant during quiet time resurfaced in my memory that same week, no longer an isolated oddity, but one clear point in a pattern I could now trace with real confidence. I found, going back through the recordings a second time, a moment on one of the April tapes where Vanessa's voice, muffled through the fabric of the bear, said something to Grant about not in front of Lily, a fragment that told me, unmistakably, that whatever this was, some part of her understood exactly how far past acceptable it had already gone. By the first week of May, I had what I needed, a pattern spanning at least 8 weeks, likely longer, 6 distinct recorded instances, and Renata's independent account corroborating at least one of them. I didn't feel triumphant assembling it. I felt something closer to grief arriving early, grief for a version of my marriage I now understood had stopped being real sometime back in February, maybe earlier, while I was still calling it stable from 400 miles away. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is harder to say plainly than the betrayal itself. I could have confronted Vanessa the day I heard that first 11 minutes of audio in Denver. I chose instead to keep listening, to keep building the case in silence. And I've asked myself since whether that was discipline or simply the same conflict avoidance that had let 2 months of small inconsistencies pass unquestioned in the first place. I think it was some of both. I wanted the whole truth in my hands before I let her see that I knew any of it at all, not to punish her with the waiting, but because I needed, for my own sake, to stop being the only person in my own house who didn't understand what was actually happening inside it. I told no one what I'd found. Not Renata, not my own brother, no one, until I had every recording labeled, dated, and organized clearly enough that there would be no room left for the kind of soft, partial explanation I suspected, correctly, that Vanessa was fully capable of constructing on short notice. I chose a Saturday morning, deliberately, when Lily was at Renata's for a planned sleepover and the house was fully, uninterruptedly quiet. I set my phone on the kitchen table before Vanessa came downstairs, recording 6 audio files already queued and labeled with their dates, and I want to be honest that some part of that choice, documenting even this final conversation, came from the same instinct that had put the recorder in the bear in the first place. I needed proof I could return to, not because I distrusted my own memory, but because I distrusted, by then, anything Vanessa might try to reshape after the fact. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the phone recording and the printed list beside it, and I watched something in her posture go very still, the particular stillness of someone who has spent weeks half expecting this exact morning and finding, now that it had arrived, that no rehearsal had prepared her for the specific shape it actually took. "Sit down," I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd had weeks to make sure of that. "I have 6 recordings. Dates, times, his voice in our house when you told me you were somewhere else. I want you to walk me through all of it, not the version that gets us through this morning." She sat. She looked at the printed list for a long moment, and I watched her search, visibly, for an angle that could survive contact with dates that specific. "How did you even?" she started, and then stopped herself, understanding, I think, that the question itself was a kind of confession. "That doesn't matter right now," I said. "What matters is you tell me the truth. All of it. Not the 4 times you're about to tell me it happened when I already know it's more." "It's not as simple as those dates make it look," she said, and I watched her try to build a frame around the evidence rather than deny it outright, questioning what the recordings could actually prove, suggesting some of what I'd heard was innocent, misread, taken out of context. Some of those times he really was just helping with something. "You're treating every single visit like it means the same thing. Renata saw Lily's car seat in your car in our driveway the day you told me you were at a birthday party across town," I said, quiet, laying my finger on that specific line in the printed list rather than raising my voice. "That's not a recording. That's your own sister. I'm not asking you to poke holes in what I have. I'm asking you to actually tell me, because right now you're still trying to make this smaller than it is, and I've had 3 weeks of listening to exactly how large it actually is." She went quiet for a long moment, still searching, I could tell, for some remaining angle of deflection, and then, watching my face, seemed to understand that the specific, dated precision of what I'd laid out had closed off every soft path she might have tried. Her composure didn't shatter. It simply, visibly, ran out of road. "Since February," she said, finally, flatly. "It's been since February. I'm not going to sit here and pretend the number is smaller than it is anymore, because clearly you already know it isn't." I didn't say anything for a moment. I let the number sit in the room the way it deserved to. "I need to hear the rest," I said. "Not the summary. What actually happened?" She was quiet again, and then, watching some middle distance rather than my face, she began, still careful, still measured, still choosing her words with the precision of someone trying to control the damage rather than simply confess it whole. "It started small, genuinely small. He was going through the divorce, and I was going through. I don't even know what to call what I was going through. Feeling like a person who used to have a career and opinions and now mostly had nap schedules. He'd asked me things nobody had asked me in 2 years. Not about Lily. About me. What I thought about a color palette. What I used to want before any of this. It felt harmless for a long time because it was just talking." She paused, glanced at the recorder, and something in her tightened further. "I'm not going to tell you it stayed just talking. You already know it didn't. I don't have a clean way to make the actual escalation sound better than it is, so I'm not going to try to smooth it for you right now." That was as far as she got that morning. When I pressed for the specifics, how it had actually crossed the line, what she'd told herself in the moment it did, she said she needed time to say it properly, that she didn't want to give me a version assembled on the spot just to survive the conversation. Something in her voice, for the first time since she'd sat down, sounded less like strategy and more like genuine exhaustion. "I need you to pack a bag," I said. "Not forever, not today even, but I need you out of this house by tonight, and I need Lily somewhere stable while we figure out what happens next. I'm done doing this the slow way." She didn't argue. I think some part of her had been waiting, by then, for exactly that sentence. Vanessa moved into her sister's guest room that same evening, 12 blocks away, close enough that Lily's routine stayed mostly intact. 10 days later, in a conversation on Renata's back porch that I'd asked for specifically, she finally gave me the fuller account she'd held back that first morning. "You asked what I told myself the first time it stopped being just talking," she said. "I need to actually answer that, because I owe you the real version, even though it doesn't make anything better." It happened in March, in his kitchen, while we were supposedly discussing paint samples. He said something about how he could tell, underneath everything, that I used to be someone before I disappeared into being just somebody's mother. And I hated how much that landed, how starved I must have been to hear it, because it wasn't even a particularly generous thing to say about the last 2 years of my life. I went home that day and thought about it for 3 straight days. I told myself it was a one-time lapse, obviously. Everyone tells themselves that, I think, and it's still completely true in the moment you're saying it. Then it happened again, 2 weeks later, and I told myself the same thing, and each time I believed it a little less and said it anyway, because admitting I didn't believe it anymore meant admitting what I'd actually let myself become. I was terrified constantly, not just of this exact morning, though obviously that too, but of what it meant that I could see him in the afternoon and then pick Lily up from daycare an hour later and read her a bedtime story like nothing in me had shifted at all. There were mornings I couldn't look at her drawings on the fridge without feeling something close to sick. I started keeping my phone in my back pocket instead of on the counter because I couldn't stand seeing it light up in the same room as her artwork. There was a night in March I almost stopped on my own. I started typing you a message, actually, sitting on the edge of our bed with her monitor glowing on the nightstand, meaning to tell you everything before it went any further. I deleted it 3 times and told myself the morning would feel different. It didn't. I just went back into hiding from myself the next day, same as every day before it. When Lily said that thing at dinner about him being there during quiet time, I remember exactly how my stomach dropped, watching you ask me about it so lightly, having no idea what you'd actually just said. That was as close as I came to telling you everything on my own terms, before any of this. I let the moment pass. I've wondered since if that's the version of this where I might have found some way back to being someone I actually recognized, instead of whatever I'd let myself become by the time you finally had the recordings. I asked her, near the end, whether she'd loved him. She said no, without much hesitation, and then admitted she wasn't entirely sure what to call the specific feeling of being asked real questions again after 2 years of feeling invisible, whether that counted as love or simply its borrowed shape. I believe that answer more than almost anything else she told me that spring. Grant's own reputation on our street didn't survive the months that followed. Renata, without much prompting from me, mentioned what she'd seen to one other neighbor, and word moves fast on a block built on shared driveways and shared birthday parties. He sold his house by late summer and moved across town, and I heard, secondhand, that at least one new client had quietly declined his contracting work once the story made its way around. A specific, visible cost that reached him whether or not he ever fully understood how far it had traveled. The divorce finalized that November. Vanessa kept regular custody time with Lily, which was right, which I never once tried to diminish, because whatever she'd broken between us, nothing in those 8 weeks undid 6 years of being a genuinely devoted mother before any of it started. I kept the house, and I kept Mr. Buttons in a drawer for a while before eventually giving him back to Lily with the recorder quietly removed. Some things, I decided, didn't need to keep serving the purpose they'd been built for. I met someone the following spring, almost a year later, a flight attendant named Priya who worked routes out of the same hub, who asked me real questions the first week we knew each other in a way that reminded me, gently, how long it had been since I'd been asked any. I wasn't looking for that. It found me anyway, slowly, the way good things sometimes do once you've stopped bracing for the bad ones. I could have stayed angry through that entire year. I chose, somewhere around the following spring, not to. That was the only kind of winning that ever actually mattered to me. I started sleeping through the night again sometime that winter, and I noticed it specifically. Not gradually, but as an actual morning where I woke and realized the low, constant static I'd been carrying since that Denver hotel room simply wasn't there anymore. I hadn't announced it to anyone. I just noticed, one ordinary Tuesday, that the weight was finally gone. I'm not the same man who sat on a hotel bed listening to 11 seconds of a stranger's voice in his own home. I'm quieter now, in a way that feels earned instead of avoidant. I ask more questions than I used to, in every relationship I have, including the new one, not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to respect for the people I choose to let close, a refusal to let silence do the work that honesty should be doing instead. The detail that lingers longest here isn't the recordings themselves. It's that Vanessa nearly told Daniel the truth, unprompted, sitting on the edge of their own bed with their daughter's monitor glowing beside her, weeks before any recorder ever forced the issue. That single moment says more about how these situations actually end than any confrontation scene can. Betrayals rarely survive because the person hiding them is skilled at deception. They survive because the moment for honesty keeps arriving quietly and getting let go, over and over, until someone else's evidence finally does the work that a single hard conversation could have done sooner. Daniel's instinct to document rather than confront, first with the recorder, then with his own labeled list of dates, reveals something worth sitting with about how he'd operated inside the marriage long before any of this started. His patience wasn't only strategy. It was also the same conflict avoidance that had let 2 months of small inconsistencies pass without a single direct question. The difference, and it's a meaningful one, is that this time his silence had a purpose and an endpoint rather than functioning as permanent avoidance. Vanessa's account of the kitchen conversation about paint samples isn't offered as an excuse, but it does explain the specific hunger that made the first small permission possible. The particular ache of being asked real questions again after 2 years of feeling reduced to a set of logistics. The tragedy isn't that she wanted to feel seen. It's that she mistook a borrowed, dishonest version of that feeling for something worth risking her marriage over. And by the time she understood the difference, the cost had already compounded past repair. The actual point of no return likely wasn't the first afternoon in Grant's kitchen. It was the moment she deleted that half-written message to Daniel for the 3rd time and told herself the next morning would feel different. That's the decision that turned a private failure into a sustained deception, and it's the detail that makes the marriage's ending feel, in hindsight, less like a single betrayal than the accumulated weight of many small choices not to stop.